intersection that I just spoke of was nothing more than some Native American trails. But that crossroads would serve as the center of town, and today it is the town square. Benjamin Chambers also noted that just about a block southwest of that intersection was the Falling Spring Creek, which emptied into the Conicajig Creek. And in the last approximately 60 to 70 yards of the Falling Spring, it dropped about 30 feet, which generated significant water power. And Ben Chambers was trained as a millwright by the age of 21, so he appreciated the strength and the potential of that water. He began felling trees in 1730 to create what was originally known as the Conicajig settlement. Now, I mentioned that word a couple of times, Conicajig. That is taken from the Delaware Indians that were prevalent in the area, and it means a long way. By March of 1734, Chambers had received a license to use the land, and he received a title for approximately 500 acres by 1742. That same year, his wife gave birth to his eldest son, James. 1744, that north-south road I mentioned, today's Route 11, was officially opened as the Great Road. Now, many of you may be familiar with that road during the Civil War. It was known as the Valley Turnpike. The original section of Chambersburg, what became known as Chambersburg, originally Chamberstown, was laid out in 1764. And at the time, the area was part of Carlisle's Cumberland County, Carlisle being the county seat. And as the population continued to thrive and grow, a section of Cumberland County was cleaved off and Franklin County was formed. And the local towns were vying to become the county seat. Well, Benjamin Chambers stayed one step ahead of everyone else by deeding a parcel of ground on the northeast quadrant of the town square, that intersection, to be used for the construction of a courthouse. And that courthouse was built in 1794, the original courthouse. The second courthouse was built in 1842. That replaced the original one. And the second courthouse would ultimately be the one that was destroyed in the fire of 1864. 1788, Congress established the Post Road, and that was the east-west route from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia that became Route 30. The town continued to thrive, and moving into the 1800s, by the 1830s, the town got another significant boost when the Cumberland Valley Railroad from Harrisburg arrived, and it selected Chambersburg as the southern terminus of the railroad. And just about a block and a half north of the courthouse in the town square was just a sprawling rail yard containing car shops and engine shops and turntables and office buildings and warehouses and all sorts of things. And just a bit of trivia about the Cumberland Valley Railroad in Chambersburg. It is given credit with actually creating the very first sleeper car. I thought that was interesting. Now, this was certainly pretty crude in comparison to some of the modern rail cars and Pullman cars we have today, but it was certainly the predecessor of all of those, of what we know today as modern sleeping cars. The one thing that the railroad didn't engage in was actually warehousing the products and goods that it transported. So that opened another door of opportunity for local people, and warehouses, privately owned warehouses, began springing up around the perimeter of the rail yard. We zoom ahead, pun intended, to 1860 just to take a look at the census. And we see that by that year, Chambersburg had approximately 5,500 residents. Franklin County, approximately 45,000 residents. Chambersburg at that time listed 3 fire companies, 11 different schools and academies, private schools, etc. 6 or 7 churches in the town, a gas works, numerous mills and foundries. It was a thriving community, much because of the railroad and much because of the intersection of those 2 very important roads. And Chambersburg was situated in the flourishing farmland of the Cumberland Valley, which is the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia's northern extension. Now we take a step back 1 year to 1859. An individual calling himself Isaac Smith arrived in Chambersburg. Now he was not here the entire year. He arrived in June and he would come and go throughout the summer. When he was in Chambersburg, he stayed at the Mary Rittner boarding house. He indicated that he was an employee of a mining company, and he was in search of iron ore deposits where he could open up mines. And from his upstairs view of from the boarding house, he could look out over the sprawling Cumberland Valley rail yard. He could see the trains coming and going. And he received some crates, some shipments by rail that were labeled mining equipment and mining tools that he would offload and take to one of the privately owned warehouses on North Main Street, the Oaks and Kaufman warehouse. Well, it wasn't until October of that year, 1859, that the residents of Chambersburg came to realize that Isaac Smith was actually John Brown. He had grown this billowy white beard as a disguise. You see, he was a wanted man for his ordering of execution-style killings in Kansas some years before, killings of pro-slavery individuals. And Isaac Smith, or John Brown, was a radical abolitionist. And he began using Chambersburg as a planning and staging area for his raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Now, in August of that same year, approximately the 19th, 20th, 21st, we're not exactly sure, Frederick Douglass came to Chambersburg specifically to meet with Isaac Smith. I keep calling him Isaac Smith. John Brown. And they tracked one another down. They had known one another prior to this meeting, but John Brown really wanted Frederick Douglass to join his efforts in this raid of Harper's Ferry. So he began to give the details and lay out his plan, and Frederick Douglass heard him out. And he was unconvinced this was the way to go. Frederick Douglass more or less said, look, John Brown, I understand what you're trying to do, but by attacking the Federal Armory, you are doing nothing short of attacking the federal government, and that is treason. Harper's Ferry is a perfect steel trap, he would go on to say in his memoirs. And Frederick Douglass more or less said, John Brown, you're all going to die. So he, needless to say, did not join him. And over the next day or two, Frederick Douglass was recognized in Chambersburg by the townsfolk. And they said, what are you doing here? Why are you in our town? And Douglass, I find this very interesting. Frederick Douglass did not give up John Brown. He covered for him. He said, I'm here to give a speech on abolition and the sins of slavery. So that evening in the town hall just next to the courthouse, Douglass spoke, gave that speech, and the next day he was off. John Brown would later begin to take those crates that he offloaded and put in the warehouse that were labeled mining equipment. They were really full of weapons that he planned on using to arm freed slaves with. And he began to transport them to the Kennedy farm in nearby Maryland, and prepared then for that ill-fated raid that took place in October of 1859. During that raid, U.S. Army was finally called in under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, and Lee had ordered one of his lieutenants a man by the name of James Ewell Brown Stewart to raid the engine house that Brown and his very small army had holed up in, broke down the door. Several of Brown's raiders were killed, including two of his sons. Brown himself was wounded and hauled off to nearby Charlestown, Virginia, where he stood trial. And in December of that year, Frederick Douglass's words proved prophetic when John Brown was hanged. This house that we see here in the middle, the Mary Rittner boarding house, still stands on East King Street in Chambersburg. It is owned by the Franklin County Historical Society. Through the remainder of 1859 and early 1860, things were fairly calm in Chambersburg. The town continued to flourish and grow. But with the firing on Fort Sumter in 1861 came a surge of patriotism here in the North. Chambersburg was no exception. By May, you can see there in the text that I provided, there were approximately 3,000 Army, 3,000 Union soldiers. 2 camps were established on the outskirts of town. By June, that number had swelled to 18 to 20,000 men, and they were commanded by General Robert Patterson, who was a relic of the Mexican War. He would prove to be really an utter failure. He marched these men into Maryland. He was supposed to track down and confront Confederate General Joe Johnston and prevent him from slipping back across the Blue Ridge to join forces with PGT Beauregard at the Battle of First Manassas, and he was unable to do that. And he was relieved of command, but Chambersburg served again as a staging ground simply because of its proximity to the railroad, the road network, and the ease of travel up and down the valley. Shortly after the war broke out, Chambersburg and Franklin County sent the Chambers Artillery to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to a camp up there. And that was Franklin County's first contribution to the Civil War. In all totaled, I counted about 28 different units with men from either Chambersburg or Franklin County that were participated in the Civil War, including another piece of trivia I find very interesting, including the 54th Massachusetts. Remember that regiment, that all-black regiment made famous by the movie Glory. There were actually 9 men from Chambersburg and 48 total from Franklin County who served with the 54th Mass. Through the remainder of 1861, there was limited soldiers in Chambersburg. I think after the Battle of First Bull Run, you know, the various sides kind of stepped back to reorganize one another, and things were quiet in the Chambersburg and Pennsylvania area. But along comes 1862, and as General Lee's army began moving northward, that's ultimately going to culminate at the Battle of Antietam, Pennsylvania's governor, Andrew Curtin, became concerned for the safety of his state, believing that Pennsylvania was the gateway to the north. And that northern route, the Valley Turnpike right up the Cumberland Valley, was an open invitation to Confederate raiders. So he started to put together an emergency militia. He called for 10,000 men, and these were untrained men who congregated in Chambersburg. Governor Curtin needed someone to command these men, and he had some political ties, and he pried away a man from General McClellan's staff to come to Chambersburg to take command. That was John Fulton Reynolds. So if you wondered why Reynolds didn't participate in the Battle of Antietam, it's because he was in Chambersburg. Well, he was supposed to be in Chambersburg. When he arrived, he was just utterly disgusted with the condition and discipline of these militia. So essentially, he arrived on the 15th. of September of 1861, and then he left with his staff and left junior officers to try to take command and whip these boys into shape. Reynolds and his staff went to Maryland, where they were kind of watching out to see what was going on. When the Battle of Antietam was on the brink, ready to go there, he sent for these men in Chambersburg, and only about a quarter of them joined him in Maryland. The rest of them said, look, we signed on to protect Pennsylvania. We're not crossing the state line. So some kind of dedication there, huh? Regardless, Reynolds and those men did not participate in the Battle of Antietam. Afterwards, after the battle was over and General Lee moved his army back across the Potomac River to Virginia, Governor Curtin declared that the emergency was over, and Reynolds was released back to McClellan, and the emergency militia were released as well. Now, interestingly, what happened prior to the Battle of Antietam was James Longstreet's wagon train, approximately 80 wagons, was captured and contained much ammunition for Longstreet's First Corps. Well, those wagons made their way into Pennsylvania and into Chambersburg, and much of that ammunition was stored in the warehouses around the rail yard. Some of it was shipped away, but much of it was in the rail yard, and it just kind of went there, and just forgotten by many people. But following that, following the battle, then Robert E. Lee, while McClellan was lingering around Maryland, Robert E. Lee decided, look, we need to do something. And he called Jeb Stuart into his camp, gave Jeb Stuart 3 important goals to achieve. Number 1, I want you to ride into Pennsylvania, and I want you to disrupt the communications and supply line that is supplying the Union Army in Maryland. Specifically, I want you to destroy as much of the Cumberland Valley Railroad as you can in Chambersburg, but also destroy the bridge, the Cumberland Valley Railroad bridge over the Conococheague Creek in Scotland. That's going to very much hamper the supplies making their way to the Army of the Potomac. The other thing Stuart was supposed to do was information. Find out all you can about the Army of the Potomac. And thirdly, Lee just wanted Stuart to have this successful raid to build morale in his own army. So Stuart arrives on the outskirts of town on October 11th. By this time, Reynolds is gone and the militia are gone. So Chambersburg is more or less undefended. Stuart begins to raid the town the following day on the 12th. And he begins to raid the warehouses, and he finds Union uniforms, and his troopers can finally get rid of some of their tattered rags that they're wearing for brand spanking new Union uniforms. He also sends one of his soldiers, William Grumble Jones, to burn the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge. Well, on their way to Scotland, where that bridge is located, they came across some civilians who inquired, hey, what are you guys doing? Well, we're off to burn the bridge at Scotland, the railroad bridge. And those quick-thinking civilians said, well, good luck with that. That bridge is made of iron. You won't burn it. Well, these Confederate raiders decided, look, we don't have explosives. We can't blow up the bridge. We're at a loss. So they just turned around and went back to Chambersburg without laying eyes on the bridge itself. There they joined Stuart, who would then set fire to the Cumberland Valley Rail Yard before saddling up and heading east, crossing South Mountain to Cashtown, where they turned south and would eventually cross the Potomac River and link up with General Lee again. Once they left the town, the civilians tried to start managing the fire that was raging there at the rail yard. Unfortunately, General Longstreet's ammunition were still in some of those warehouses, and it went up like the 4th of July fireworks display. So the Cumberland Valley Rail Yard, after Stewart's raid, was completely destroyed, completely lost. The railroad administrators understood they had a lucrative contract with the federal government. So they began to rebuild right away. They couldn't let that money go. They began rebuilding and get the railroad back in operation as quickly as possible. Again, just like the previous year, the remainder of the year was fairly quiet in Chambersburg. Now here's a couple of illustrations from Harper's Weekly. The top one shows the courthouse with a 120-foot tall flagpole that was erected 2 days after the firing on Fort Sumter. And the town hall to the left of the courthouse is where Frederick Douglass spoke. And these are Stewart's raiders riding through the town square. And the lower illustrations show the soldiers there raiding the warehouse, getting some new uniforms, and then the burning of the rail yard to the right. As 1863 rolled around, campaign season began with warmer weather. General Lee, for many reasons, began to move his army north. It's going to be known as the 1863 Gettysburg or Pennsylvania Campaign, culminated Battle of Gettysburg. June 15th, the lead units of Lee's army enter the town of Chambersburg. That is Albert Gallatin Jenkins' cavalry. They cut telegraph lines, they tore up the railroad track at the rail yard again, and they actually made their way to Scotland and found a bridge. It was not made of iron, and they torched it. That illustration you see there shows the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge burning. Now, I often snicker wondering what it would have been like had Twitter and YouTube and Facebook been around for Jenkins to post these pictures. I wonder if Grumble Jones would have grumbled any more loudly when he saw that bridge actually burning and it wasn't made of iron. Part of Jenkins' men, just like part of Stewart's men the year before, camped at Alexander McClure's Norland. Norland was the name of Alexander McClure's approximately 60-acre farm about a half a mile north of the town square. And Alexander McClure was a very strong Republican who was instrumental in getting Pennsylvania to vote for Abraham Lincoln. As a result, Lincoln gave him a post. McClure would later resign from that Washington, D.C. post to join Governor Curtin in Harrisburg as a member of Curtin's military advisory board. But McClure called Chambersburg home. He was born and raised in Perry County, but now he called Chambersburg home, and he was the editor of a local Republican newspaper as well. Part of the Confederates stayed at his farm before making their way northward, even further north during the Pennsylvania campaign, eventually arriving outside of Harrisburg. As that campaign continued on June 25th, General Ewell arrived, raided the town, collected as much as he could for his army, subsistence-wise, livestock, horses. Franklin County claims to have had between 35 and 40,000 head of livestock taken by the Confederate forces during this campaign. In addition to that, another 20,000 or so horses. Really had an effect on the population for the upcoming winter months, lacking all that livestock for food and working farms and such. General Hill arrives on the 26th, along with General Lee. Here's an illustration showing Lee and Hill, the town square, where they would meet, and Lee would give Hill orders to move eastward. This is actually looking south down what is today South Main Street. The building off to the right there, let me get my laser pointer going here. Building here off to the right with the columns is not the courthouse. That is the Bank of Chambersburg. The courthouse is actually over here. This is the Bank of Chambersburg, and right next to it, this building is the Franklin Hotel. The Franklin Hotel was used as a hospital following the Battle of Antietam. It would be used as a hospital again following the Battle of Gettysburg, as were a couple of other larger buildings in the town. Longstreet arrived on the 27th of June, also moved east. Finally, on the 28th, Lee at his headquarters just east of Chambersburg in the parking lot of today's Pizza Hut, decided to congregate his army around Cashtown or Gettysburg. And that certainly led to the clash for those 3 days in July of 1863. Following that battle, Lee's army retreated back through Franklin County, and some of the wagon train of wounded ended up being diverted to Chambersburg, where some of those hospitals were treating both Union and Confederate soldiers. Those hospitals would stay in existence for some time until the soldiers were well enough to be transported home or to prison camps or to other hospitals in larger cities. With the conclusion of the Gettysburg campaign, Franklin County and Pennsylvania seemed to be somewhat safe again for the time being. Let me find here. In early June of 1863, actually before the Confederates arrived, the governor was instrumental in forming the Department of the Susquehanna. That happened on June 10th. And that was just another military district in Pennsylvania. And it was put under the command of General Darius Couch, who was a Second Corps commander at the Battle of Chancellorsville under Hooker. He resigned from that post, being disgusted with Hooker, and he was put in command of the Department of the Susquehanna. Couch was really a commander of thousands and thousands of troops on paper only. In reality, he had very few troops at his disposal. So as the Confederates began moving north, there was really nothing Couch could do but move his paperwork in his office by railroad northward to Harrisburg until the Confederates cleared out. All right, so we're going to now begin to discuss, one thing I did forget to mention was the last Confederate Union to leave Chambersburg on their way to Gettysburg was a division in Longstreet's Corps under the command of a man by the name of General George. It was actually the rear guard of the Army of Northern Virginia, and he, upon getting orders to leave for Gettysburg, the last thing he did in Chambersburg was once again burn the Cumberland Valley Rail Yard. So 2 years in a row, kind of a little bit of foreshadowing there, I guess, the railroad went up in flames. This time, the rail yard authorities decided, we'll repair the track, but we're not going to put a lot of expense into rebuilding until we know we're safe. So 1864 rolls around. There's a new commander of the Union armies, Ulysses Grant, and he has a multi-pronged plan for defeating the various Confederate armies. One of these prongs includes the use of this man, David Hunter, to raid the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia and destroy anything of military value that he can find for the Confederates. And he takes things a little too far. And in Lexington, Virginia, he ends up burning VMI. There's the remains of it, you can see. And next door to VMI was Washington College. And although he didn't burn Washington College, he gave free rein to his troopers to raid and pillage and plunder the college. And while he's there, he also burned the private homes of private individuals, including Governor John Letcher of Virginia. Well, this was just too much for General Lee when he got that information, and he dispatched General Jubal Early to drive Hunter out of the Shenandoah Valley. And there were some clashes around Lynchburg. Finally, Hunter retreated. His army, he knew, was outnumbered. So he retreated into what was then West Virginia, into the mountains. Early thought he did his job, and Early then proceeded northward up the valley, ultimately arriving to take part in the Battle of Monocacy before arriving on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. And while he did that, Hunter reappeared. General Hunter reappeared in Jefferson County at Charlestown, now West Virginia, the same place where John Brown was hanged. And he started his old antics again of taking matters into his own hand and to extremes and burning things. And he burned more private homes, including a home of a distant relative of Robert E. Lee, a man by the name of Edmund Lee. But he also burned the home of his first cousin, Andrew Hunter, which I find just astounding. He had his cousin, Andrew Hunter, arrested. Now, these two were so close before the war. When Andrew Hunter was arrested, he was wearing a ring on his finger that was given to him by his cousin, the general. And war I guess, does strange things to families. Well, by this time, when the word got to General Early, he had had enough. And he decided to seek retribution for these, what he considered war atrocities, burning private homes and such. And here's a quote from General Early. "I came to the conclusion that it was time to open the eyes of the people of the North to this enormity by an example of the way of retaliation." General Early, when asked about his plans to ransom and burn Chambersburg by one of the local residents here who wrote a book, he pretty much just came out and said, yep, it was my doing, my orders. I have no remorse over it. I told him to do it. I told him to burn the town. Early selected General John McCausland, man sometimes known as Tiger John, to carry out this raid. Now, McCausland had approximately 2,100 men with him, several brigades under the command of Harry Gilmore, Bradley Johnson, and he began to retrace the same route that Jeb Stuart used to get to Chambersburg. And he left and crossed the Potomac River just close to Clear Spring, Maryland, the red arrows you see there in that map, made his way to Mercersburg. And by this time, General Couch in Chambersburg was receiving information that the Confederates are marching northward again. So he had only a couple of hundred men in Chambersburg at his disposal for defense. Fortunately, some of them belonged to the 6th United States Cavalry. So they actually had some veterans there who arrived and went to Mercersburg to try to slow down the approach of the rebel forces. That was buying time for General Couch to pack up all the belongings of the headquarters, Chambersburg. When that was seen by the residents, they got a little nervous again. Hey, what's going on? 3 years in a row, are we going to be visited again? So the Bank of Chambersburg loaded up all of its assets into the safe and rolled it to a wagon, hauled it to the railroad, loaded it into a boxcar, and sent it north on the railroad along with all the other government property. So the bank was pretty much emptied out of all funds. Meanwhile, in Mercersburg, the evening of the 29th, I believe it was, of July of 1864, the lead units of the rebels arrived, and it's pretty dark, but they were met by the 6th Cavalry, the 6th U.S. Cavalry, who slowed them down a little bit. But knowing that the Union troops were outnumbered, they began to withdraw back towards what is today St. Thomas on U.S. Route 30 west of Chambersburg, and proceeded eastward towards Chambersburg to Fairground Hill, which is a large hill about a mile and a half west of Chambersburg on Route 30. And they set up an ambush there. And in the pitch black, approximately 3 o'clock in the morning of July 30th of 1864, the Confederate lead forces, the cavalry, began to arrive in that road. And they were awakened by the thunderous sound of one artillery piece that the Union troops had. And they began firing from the center of the road from behind barricades. And they held them off for about 2 hours from that position until it got light enough for the Confederates to see what was in front of them. The Union troops by this point realized, we're going to be flanked. We are heavily outnumbered. Let's live to fight another day. So they limbered up their single artillery piece and headed northward towards Shippensburg to safety. Leaving Chambersburg yet again undefended. And as dawn began to arrive in the morning of July 30th, General McCausland would make this home the home of farmer Henry Greenewalt, his temporary headquarters. And at dawn of July 30th, again, a mile west of Chambersburg, the Confederate troopers could be seen around this farm, stirring, waking up, their horses grazing in the fields around the buildings. General McCausland gathered his staff in one of the downstairs rooms of this home, where he began to lay out his plans to ransom the town of Chambersburg and ultimately to burn the town. Mrs. Greenewalt overheard this conversation and would later relay how many officers were hearing this for the very first time. They had no idea that they were supposed to burn the town regardless of the outcome of the ransom. Several of the officers voiced their disapproval and their concern. They said, we're better than this. We should not be engaging in burning the town for this. So there was definitely some dissent in the rebel officers. About the same time, in the town of Chambersburg itself, dawn of July 30th, the civilians found themselves probably arising from an uneasy sleep. Undoubtedly knowing the Confederates were once again on their doorsteps just outside of the town. And they were well aware of potential danger and damage to the town once again. They survived 2 raids so far in the last 2 years with little to no damage to private property, the biggest destruction being the rail yards. Biggest concerns of the civilians now was the safety of their own homes, their own families, the businesses, and ultimately the town itself. Dawn of July 30th, 1864, outside of Petersburg, Virginia, the Union Army was preparing to detonate a tremendous blast in a mine that was dug by former Pennsylvania coal miners, what would ultimately be known as the Battle of the Crater. Some of these soldiers that were slated to be the very first marching into that crater were members of the 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery. Now, these men were originally stationed in the defenses around Washington, D.C., but recently they were pulled away to bolster the Union lines around Petersburg. They were thrown in here as infantry. These men were concerned about, what lies ahead of them entering that crater. And many of them were completely unaware of what was going to happen. in their hometown of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. About 5:30, McCausland's forces make their way into the town. This is 5:30 a.m., July 30th. They announced their presence before they made their way in the town by lobbing several artillery shells from Fairground Hill west of town across the town into the town. Nobody's quite sure how many shells were fired, probably anywhere from 1 to 6. We just don't know exactly. Little to no damage occurred. McCausland made his way into the town where he would have breakfast in the Franklin Hotel. If you remember, that was used as a hospital. I kind of pointed that out in the one illustration we saw a little earlier. On the right-hand photograph here, this is a reenactment that takes place during Chambers Fest, which I think is an odd name for an anniversary of the town being burned. Why is it a fest? But anyway, reenactors there, and a picture of the second courthouse that was erected there in 1842. You can see there's columns on the right there. There was another entrance. The current courthouse does not have that. After breakfast, General McCausland issued his ransom note to some individuals in the town. We demand $500,000 in Yankee currency or $100,000 in gold. If not, the town will be burned. Well, the townsfolk explained to General McCausland, look, we have no money. The bank's right next door to where you had breakfast. Go in and check it out. The money's gone. We have nothing to give. General McCausland said, look, if you don't get the money to us in 3 hours, we will burn the town. He is stressing that the town will be burned. Of course, the civilian population did not believe that at all. Certainly, you are not going to burn an entire town because we can't meet a ransom demand. That's just completely unheard of. We just don't understand how you would even come to say something like that. So they didn't really even try to gather any money, sort of a good faith effort. Finally, McCausland went over, had a soldier go over to the courthouse and ring that bell. And that was announcing for the townspeople to gather at the town square. And once again, he issued this demand. Well, General McCausland never had orders to stay in the town and wait. This was supposed to be a fast-moving raid. He understood that there were Union soldiers nearby, within 10 to 12 miles away, so he could not dilly-dally here in Chambersburg. He had to be off as quickly as he could. Most people agree that he did not wait anywhere close to the 3 hours he said he would, and probably by 7 or 7:30 in the morning, the fires were beginning. I have a few accounts from some eyewitnesses, some civilians that I'm going to read here and there because they lived through it. So they can do a little better justice explaining how things played out better than I can. But again, by 7:30, the fires were started. A man by the name of Reverend Benjamin Schneck, S-C-H-N-E-C-K, who lived in Chambersburg, just about a block and a half northeast of the courthouse we see here. He wrote a book. It was actually several letters to relatives that were later compiled into a book, and it's one of the most graphic about the burning of Chambersburg. And he said, the citizens stated that it was utterly impossible to pay the sum named on either gold or currency, and that the demand could not be made in good faith. They further remonstrated against the monstrosity of burning an entire town of 6,000 inhabitants in retaliation for the 6 or 8 houses that they had said were burned in Virginia. So again, the town really didn't believe this was going to happen until the first fires were started. The first flames were started with giving credit to a Confederate, if for no other reason than his name was Hugh Sparks. True or not, I don't know. It's one of those stories, but there was a Hugh Sparks in Company F of the 37th Virginia Cavalry. Barrels of kerosene were found in some of the merchants downtown, wheeled over to the courthouse, placed in some of the stairwells, and the courthouse was ignited. This was the first building. Benjamin Schneck went on to say of how these fires continued to be lit. A squad of men would approach a house, break open the door, and kindle a fire with no other notice to the inmates except to get out of the way as soon as they could. In many cases, 5, 10, 15 minutes were asked to secure clothing, which were refused. Many families escaped with only the clothing they had on and such as they could gather up in their own haste. In many cases, they weren't even allowed to take these extra clothes with them, but were threatened with instant death if they did not cast them away and flee. Now, to be fair, there were some Confederates who did not want anything to do with this, and they did help some civilians to gather some belongings and take them out of the house. Some of them refused to participate in burning the homes, and they were sent off to guard the roads in and out of town to prevent anybody arriving or leaving from the town. Unfortunately, they were few and far between. While McCausland was waiting for an answer, many of the soldiers had already been busy breaking into the inns, taverns, and merchants and had found liquor. So we had a lot of Confederates who were under the influence while this mayhem and chaos were going on. A local bookseller by the name of John Shyrock says, bundles were fired upon women's backs. Ladies were forced to carry back into the houses articles of clothing they had saved from the flames. Drunken wretches danced upon the furniture and articles of value and ornament. Women's person were searched in the most indecent manner. Oaths and foul language abounded. So there was a lot of chaos, a lot of mayhem, a lot of drunken, disorderly Confederate soldiers. One of the other places that was intended, there's an illustration or a painting done by a friend of the family showing the courthouse in flames. Again, right in the middle there, you can see the flagpole still stands. And here's the town hall again where Frederick Douglass spoke. This next building over here was the mercantile store of Jacob Hoke, who wrote a book called The Great Invasion about the 1863 invasion. And he also corresponded with General Early and did a book on the burning of Chambersburg afterwards as well. But he lost his entire home and store during the fire. Jacob Hoke, again, the owner of that store, reminisced, a man unbuckled his sword. This was a Confederate soldier who was absolutely heartbroken at what his army was doing. He said, another man unbuckled his sword and put it in our house in disgust at the scene before him. It was found afterwards in the ruins. At the door, I found the officer previously referred to weeping bitterly. So there was definitely some remorse amongst some of the Confederates. However, there was also some misfortune because some of them got separated. Major A. Calder Bailey, who was adjutant of the 8th Virginia, had been consuming alcohol, and he gets separated from the rest of his troops. And he wandered away from them and the safety of the Confederate forces. When he was seen, he was shot by civilians or shot at and wounded. And he ran into one of the burning structures where he sought refuge. He could not take it because it was so hot from the flames. And he burst out with his hands in the air, pleading for his life where he was shot and killed. So some of the civilians were fighting back. There were some civilians likewise who were fired upon who attempted to put out the fires. A rebel soldier threatened to kill a young man by blowing his brains out if he would not allow the fire to burn. One of the places intentionally targeted was the home, Norland, that's the rebuilt home right there on the right, of Alexander McClure. McClure was in Harrisburg. He wasn't present at the time, but his wife was at the home, and she understood what was about to happen, and she more or less said to the soldiers, look, if you're going to burn my home, just get on with it. Well, Captain Frederick Smith was leading the contingent of rebels here at Norland who burned the home, and Frederick Smith was helping himself to anything he could find of value in the home, strapped it to his horse, and was seen riding off with it later. Some of his soldiers helped Mrs. McClure gather some family heirlooms and belongings from the home before it was burned. Frederick Smith was the son of William Extra Billy Smith. This home was then rebuilt and is part of Chambersburg's Wilson College today. This is a more famous print by Dale Gallen, taken from the west from Fairground Hill, where the Confederate artillery was, overlooking the town. And I like to show this one when I read another quote from Benjamin Schneck. Reverend Schneck says this. Now just look at this image while I read this. The day was sultry and calm, not a breath stirring, and each column of smoke rose black, straight, and single, first one, then another, and another, until the columns blended and commingled, and then one vast and lurid column of smoke and flame rose perpendicular to the sky and spread out into a vast crown, like a cloud of sackcloth hanging over the doomed city. Whilst the roar and the surging, the crackling and crash of falling timbers and walls broke upon the still with a fearful dissonance, and the screams and sounds of agony of burning animals, hogs and cows and horses made the welkin horrid with sounds of woe. It was a scene to be witnessed and heard only once in a lifetime. So what you need to go back and take from that is that the people were allowed to get out, but behind the homes, behind the businesses, in the center of the towns, the blocks, the city blocks, were the stables and barns and the animals that were not rescued. And they just perished in the flames. I can't imagine the sounds and the smells and the sights of this horrible, horrible act of revenge. With the deed finished and the town in flames, McCausland's men left. They were out of town by noon. Okay, they headed west. They had orders to disrupt and destroy as much of the B&O Railroad, the C&O Canal, and the coal fields of western Maryland as they could. They were pursued by General William Averill's cavalry, Union cavalry, who were in Greencastle. When they found out about McCausland being in Chambersburg, Averill took his men northeastward and waited for them east of Chambersburg, suspecting they would leave the town by that direction. Instead, McCausland left to the west. So Averill was pursuing through the burning town, chasing after McCausland. Eventually, about 2 weeks after the burning, McCausland would meet a Union force at the Battle of Moorefield, West Virginia. McCausland's force being defeated there. McCausland would go on to survive the war. What I'm going to do now is show you some images, post-burning images. Within a couple of weeks, two separate photographers arrived. One was a man by the name of C.L. Lockman from Carlisle. He captured a lot of the destruction around the town. The other photographer, I can't find his name just now. I believe he was from Maryland somewhere. But together, we're going to take a look at a number of photographs. I don't imagine too many of you are real familiar with Chambersburg's layout, the town layout, but I did include a map with each image, and the arrow is pointing in the direction of the camera, from the camera's point of view. So right here is the town square. This is the courthouse, the red box you see there. And this is the Falling Spring Creek, the Conacajig, and the star is the actual site of what was Fort Chambers, Benjamin Chambers' original establishment. So this is Route 11 going this way, north and south, and this is Route 30 right here. So this is actually that side entrance to the courthouse. You can see the debris, all the bricks piled up below it. Now, interestingly, the columns from the destroyed columns here that we see weren't totally lost, and they were salvaged and reused on the front of the courthouse that stands today, which is kind of neat. This is looking eastward from where that previous image was taken. Just did almost a 180 and looking westward at the Bank of Chambersburg. Those columns are the front of that bank. Right here, you can see the tin roof or the copper roof, whichever it would have been, that had collapsed. But here you have piles of brick being cleaned up by a lot of black laborers. But these bricks being reclaimed and recycled, reused for future buildings. This wall we see here was the southern wall of the Franklin Hotel where McCausland had his breakfast. Incidentally, many of these images can be found online. The best ones in the Library of Congress. They're very high resolution. This is looking west right out modern Route 30. Right down here is, you can see the low ground here. That is where the road crosses the Conacajig Creek. Again, destruction here. The other end of the Franklin Hotel, piles of bricks. And here is the remnants of the Golden Lamb Hotel in the northwestern quadrant of the square. This is taken from the Market Street Bridge. Market Street being Route 30 today, looking southward down the Conacajig Creek. So you can see how wide the creek was fairly substantial. It's still pretty wide today, but you can see the destruction off to the right there of those buildings. What's interesting about this photograph is this image right here in the middle. This is one of the two churches that were destroyed by fire. The other church was immediately behind the courthouse, so there was really no way that one was going to be saved. This church was deliberately targeted by the rebels because they found out it was an African-American congregation. So they deliberately fired that church. This was the Methodist church. It was not rebuilt in the same location following the fire. Next image is looking due south from the square. This is a similar view that we had of that illustration of General Lee and Hill during the 1863 Gettysburg campaign. Again, just the walls, the empty walls with piles of brick. This image here is the Zion Church. It was not destroyed by fire. This is a close-up of the pile of brick right here. Keep in mind this church here, this steeple, because the photographers used high points for some of these images. And we're going to see the next one, I believe, is actually taken from that steeple looking northward. Yeah, this was taken from that steeple. So here in the orange circle, we have the square, the town diamond. Right there's that flagpole. You can see it. Right here are the columns. If you can see my arrow there, right here are the columns of the courthouse. The Bank of Chambersburg is here. And in the red circle is the King Street School. You can see a large building with a cupola. That was not damaged by the fire either. Now the yellow line I have right here drawn is really the 38th parallel, if you will, of Chambersburg. If you look above that yellow line, you're going to see destruction. If you look below that yellow line, the buildings are not destroyed or damaged. So that is really the Washington Street intersection, and that's where the fire was arrested, was able to be put under control there. But you can see the stark difference between two sides of that yellow line. Image taken from the market house. An old postcard in the lower right-hand corner of this slide shows the market house. Today that is all enclosed and much larger. Cupola is still there, and that is the town's borough office building, Borough Hall today. The photographers were able to get up in that cupola and take a series of photographs and include a very large panorama, and this is a portion of that panorama. Fairground Hill, you see pointed out there in the distance, is where McCausland's artillery fired on the town, and that's also where that painting by Dale Gallen was taken from. The Bank of Chambersburg, you can see the tall flagpole in the diamond. Cedar Grove Cemetery, I have pointed out right here on this hill. And the reason I have that pointed out is that became a gathering place for the civilians during the fire. It was a safe haven, a cemetery. Okay, and they went there, and from that vantage point on that hill, they were able to see their beloved town being consumed by flames. Over here is the school, the King Street School again, and the old courthouse buildings. And I believe I have a couple more from the cupola. Yeah, here's another one taken from the cupola of that market house, again in a southwesterly direction. And you can see another church that was spared by the Confederates, the Zion Reformed, no, that's the Lutheran church here. This is a Lutheran church. But in the foreground, this is the center of the town blocks. These are the stables and the barns where all of those animals would have been consumed horribly, horribly by the fire. Another image taken from the cupola, and in the distance, very faint, you can see that King Street School again. We're going to have the next photograph, I believe, taken from up there looking south. Next to it, this other cupola is the Franklin County Prison, also a building that was not burned by the fire, still stands today. And interesting, this false front, clear over here to the right, is one of the oldest Masonic lodges in the state of Pennsylvania. And the story goes that one of the rebels was a Mason. He understood the importance of this building, and he posted guards so the Masonic Lodge in Chambersburg would not be burned. It still stands today. Building photograph from the King Street School. You can see where the last images were taken here in the Market House cupola. And over here is that Zion church steeple we saw photographed. But this is looking out towards the courthouse. The courthouse would have been obscured here by this tree. But again, the damage to the buildings in the foreground. Taken from the corner of today's King and Main Street, just showing the enormity of the destruction. All that stands is brick and stone. This large building in the distance we can see right here. You just see the gable. That's the other church that was burned immediately behind the courthouse, which would be on the other side of these walls here. This is an image taken again from Market Street looking north up the Conococheague towards the King Street Bridge. And this is where, right in this area, is where the Falling Spring empties into the Conococheague. And I simply include this one because right here where I'm circling is the area of the original Fort Chambers, a settlement by Benjamin Chambers, again, burned by the Confederates. When the fire was over, I have come across so many different statistics. We're going to go with this because it's written in stone. This is a memorial that stands today on the southwestern quadrant of the town diamond, the town square. 537 buildings destroyed. Breakdown are 278 houses, 271 barns and stables. Total real estate value, you can see there, $713,284. If you Google that, it comes to right around $26,987,000 in today's currency, okay? 2,000 people left homeless. Amazingly, only one civilian death, a man by the name of Daniel Parker. He was a former slave, and he didn't die from the fire. He didn't die from rebels. He died of a heart attack during the confusion. Interestingly, as I alluded to earlier, one area of the town that was spared from the fire was the Cumberland Valley Railroad, because after being burned twice, they just didn't rebuild, so there's nothing left to burn. Some of the privately owned warehouses surrounding the railroad were spared as well, and they became homeless shelters, interestingly enough, where people who lost their homes could congregate for food and shelter. One more quote from Benjamin Schneck. Reverend Schneck says this: "Never was there so little saved at an extensive fire. 69 pianos were consumed. The most sacred family relics, keepsakes, and portraits of deceased friends, old family Bibles, handed down from the past generations, and the many objects imparting priceless value to a Christian home, and which can never be replaced, were all destroyed." So the last slide I'm going to leave you with is a modern view of Memorial Square. You can see the rebuilt courthouse with Benjamin Franklin, Franklin County on the top of it. The columns you can see there, the white ones, are the ones spared from the fire and reused. This fountain and the soldier were dedicated in 1878 to the men from Franklin County who served in the Civil War, but today the fountain is surrounded by memorials to all Franklin County men and women who served from the American Revolution up to and including Vietnam and more recently the Middle Eastern Wars. And we have a night view of the fountain there on the right. So that concludes my program, and I thank you. I think I went a little longer than I anticipated, but certainly, hopefully I covered everything. And certainly if you have any questions, we can open it up now. And yes, that is me in 1968.
Tracy, thank you very much. That was really interesting. If anybody wants to ask a question, your microphone's been muted, so you need to unmute yourself. And feel free to ask away. So Tracy, you said McCausland survived the Civil War?
Yeah, he was actually, I'm not sure, he was actually the last or next to the last Confederate general to die. Somewhere around 1927 range. That date may be off, but it was around there. It was around the early 1900s somewhere, yeah. He never showed regret. He never showed remorse, and he was hated. He was called the Hun of Chambersburg by the residents.
The David Hunter on the other side, was he one of the ones on the jury for Mary Surratt? Do you know?
Oh, I don't know that. I don't know that.
It was a
I
David
have never
Hunter,
heard that.
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
if
I've
it's
never
the same
heard
one.
that. He ultimately was relieved of command because of his actions. Grant did relieve him.
Because of his actions in Chambersburg?
Because of his indiscriminate burning of private homes and such, yeah.
Tracy, was McCausland regular Army or was he an irregular?
You know, that's a good question. I'm inclined to say he was regular Army, but I don't know that for a fact. Interestingly, you know, before the ransom of Chambersburg, he had actually been in Maryland doing similar feats. He ransomed Frederick, Maryland, and Hagerstown, Maryland. And in Hagerstown, he handed the ransom note to the people who met the $20,000 demand rather easily. And, you know, afterwards, when McCausland left town, he realized, hey, I didn't have spell check on when I was typing up that ransom note. I missed a zero. I was supposed to be $200,000 and he got 20,000, but you know, his dumb mistake, he's not going to go back and say, oops, my bad. But you know, he really didn't do any damage to Frederick and Hagerstown because they were in Maryland, you know, and there's as many Southern sympathizers as Northern. So, you know, he was really convinced, don't do any damage here because it could be more harm than good.
McCausland was a VMI graduate, but that was 1857, and he did not serve in the regular army.
Okay.
I have a question. I have an ancestor who was in McCausland's brigade. And
Okay.
just as a coincidence, some friends and I are going to retrace the route next week using Ted Alexander's.
Yeah. Ted Alexander was a beloved historian, local historian from the Greencastle area, and he did a lot of research on the burning. We just lost him a couple of months ago. Yeah, he was also the chief historian at Antietam battlefield.
Any highlights we should not miss, or?
Well, if you go down to McCoy's Ferry, it's just, don't take a big vehicle because it's a very narrow underpass you have to get through to get out there. And there's boat docks there now. There's not a whole lot to see, but it is a fairly wide yet shallow crossing of the Potomac River. If you have an opportunity from McCoy's Ferry, you can just take a quick couple of minutes, literally just a few minutes west to Fort Frederick State Park, which is one of those stone French and Indian War, Revolutionary War star forts. Pretty impressive. And it was garrisoned during the Civil War for a short time, but not for very long because there's really no value there. But that's worth seeing. It certainly has nothing to do with McCausland's raid, but it's a neat old fort. Chambersburg, I would just say there's a visitor center on the town square that you can visit, and they may have some information you can look up there. There are a number of buildings that were not destroyed by the fire that you can see. You can go see the John Brown House, the Mary Rittner boarding house, the old jail, some things like that. There's not a whole lot left after the fire.
How long did it take Chambersburg to rebuild?
It was just an ongoing thing. You know, originally it was mostly these two-story homes and stores right on the street. And over the next several decades, they would be rebuilt into 3- and 4-story buildings that still stand today. Most of them don't really show too many remnants of the fire in the foundations. My mother-in-law had a store on South Main Street that, you know, I was in the cellar of that many times, and there was really nothing there to see that would indicate it was original, rebuilt upon. So I don't know that there's a lot of remnants in the cellars. There may be a few. Certainly the old jail, if you can if you're going to visit that, that's the home of the Cumberland, or the Franklin County Historical Society. You may want to call ahead to see if you can get a tour of that. They also will give tours of the John Brown House, but I think you have to have reservations this day and age.
Somewhere I read on the route north, there's a house that still has bullet holes in it. You know anything about that?
Could be. There was some skirmishing around Mercersburg, so there may be some in there. there's a building on the western side of Chambersburg on Glen Street that supposedly has artillery shell fragments that would have come from one of McCausland's cannons.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, Tracy, that was really interesting. I didn't know half of all that stuff, so I appreciate your coming on, spending the evening with us.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, it's you know, a new age that we have to do it this way. It would have been wonderful to be able to do it in person, but I'm honored to be able to have shared it with you this way. That's for sure.
Well, it's better than not being able to meet at all, I guess.
Yeah. Yep. That's right. That's right.
All right. Well, thank you all, and we'll see you next month, if not sooner.
Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Good night.
All right. Thanks for putting it together.
Thank you.
Sure.